Alright guys, so now we have 9.2, so we're going to be solving the quadratic equation by completing the square. So remember, a quadratic equation is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. That's how we know we're going to solve it. And when we're completing the square, our a is going to equal 1 most of the time, and our b is even. There will be times where a doesn't equal 1, but I'll show you how that works in just a little bit. So let's get started. We're going to start with a little bit of a review. So whenever you have a perfect square trinomial, that means you have a binomial squared that turns into a trinomial. So if you have x plus y, parentheses squared, it equals x squared plus 2xy plus y squared. Now, the only difference here is if it's subtraction, then after your first term, it's going to be subtraction as well. So this is section 6.4. This is what we've been doing. So if we have x squared plus 4x plus 4, what I notice is my first and my last term are perfect squares and my middle term is even. So remember, step 1, you take the square root of x squared, so that would be x. Step 2, take the square root of the third term, which would be square root of 4, which is 2. Then step 3, you have to check it, so you go 2 times x times 2. So 2 times 2 is 4x. Then step 4 is you set up your binomial squared, and you go x, follow whatever the sign is, plus 2, parentheses squared. Okay, so that was working for it. Pause it and do this one for me. Alright, so we have x squared minus 6x plus 9. We have 3 terms. My first and my last term are perfect squares, so I'm going to take the square root of x squared, which is x, the square root of 9, which is 3. Then I've got to check it, so I'm going to go 2 times x times 3, which 2 times 3 would be 6x. That matches. So then I go my binomial squared, that should be x minus 3, parentheses squared. Hopefully you got that one right. Now from chapter 5, so this is in 94, when you see a binomial squared, you can plug it into this form, but typically when we see a binomial squared, we think of the FOIL method. Okay, so x times x, x squared, plus x times 4, 4x, 4 times x, 4x, 4 times 4, 16. So we got x squared plus 8x plus 16. So this is working the forward way, which you learned in 94. This is working the backwards way, which you learned in chapter 6 of 95. Okay, these are all perfect square trinomials. So what we got to do to complete the square is we have to find the perfect square trinomial, and this is how we do it. First thing we have to do is we have to decide what goes into the blank. So if I have x squared plus 8x equals blank, I got to figure out what's going to go in the blank. How I do this is step 1 is I half the middle term, so I take my b and I divide it by 2, so my b is 8, and I divide it by 2, and I want to make sure and keep the sign, so if this was a negative 8x, then I would want it to be negative 8. Alright, so 8 divided by 2 would leave me with 4, and then take the answer to step 2 and square it. So then we're going to take this value and we're going to square it, which should leave me with 16. So what goes into the blank is the 16. Then the other part, remember how we took a trinomial and we turned it into a binomial squared? To turn it into a binomial squared, you take your x plus whatever you did when you divided it by 2, your b divided by 2, and then you square that result. Okay, so we completed the perfect square trinomial and we made it into a binomial squared. I want to see both of these answers. Okay, so that's what we're going to practice right now. We're going to find what goes into the blank. We're going to half the middle term, then we're going to square that value. Okay, so if I have x squared minus 22x equals blank, plus blank, I'm trying to figure out the blank, so I'm going to take my b divided by 2, and then I'm going to square that result. So my b is negative 22. I'm going to divide that by 2, so that's negative 11. Then I'm going to square that result, because it can't be negative to be a perfect square trinomial. So that's going to be 121. Okay, so that's what I've got to plug into my blank. And then I'm going to write it as a binomial, so that'd be x minus 11 parentheses squared. So those would be my two answers. So pause it, I want you to do B, and I want you to do C. Alright, so we got x squared plus 12x plus blank. So first thing I want to do is I want to take my B and I want to divide it by 2. So that would be 12 divided by 2, which would be 6. Then I want to square that result, which would be 36. So that's what I put in my blank. And I'd go x plus 6 squared. X squared minus 14x plus blank. First thing I want to do is I want to take my b and I want to divide it by 2, and then I'll square that result. So I'm going to take negative 14 divided by 2, which would be negative 7. Then I would square that result, which would be a positive 49. Okay, so that's what I write in my blank. Then I'm going to go x minus 7 parentheses squared. Alright, what to look for before you can complete the square. So standard form for a quadratic equation, we have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. We need our a to be 1 and our b to be even. So if I have x squared plus 2x minus 3 equals 0, I notice that my a definitely equals 1 and my b is even, so we could complete the square with this example. For this one, I've got x squared minus 4x plus 2 equals 0. I've got 3 terms. My a is even, and my a is 1 and my b is even, so I could complete the square with this one. That's actually another thing that you want to look for, 3 terms. It's kind of, it's kind of important. Okay, so 3 terms, a equals 1 and b is even. Okay, so how to complete the square. First thing you do is you move the constant to the right side of the equal sign. Second thing you do is open blank on both sides. Third thing you do is you complete the square, so you add on both sides. Fourth thing you do is you factor the new perfect square trinomial, and then you solve using the square root property, so what we did in 9.1. So I'm going to take this first example of x squared plus 2x minus 3 equals 0, and we're going to talk through it. Even though we have a couple more examples, I want to talk through this one specifically. So what we're going to do first is we're going to move the constant to the right side. So the constant is just whatever that whole number is by itself, the c. Alright, so I'm going to add 3 on both sides. So my next step is I'm going to have an open blank. So I'm going to go x squared plus 2x plus blank equals 3 plus blank. Okay, and you want to make sure and have an open blank on both sides, and it's always plus blank. Next thing you want to do is you want to complete the square. So you're going to take your b divided by 2 parentheses squared. So my b is 2. So 2 divided by 2 is 1. So I've got 1 squared, which is 1. So what I add to one side, I have to add to the other side. So that's the completing the square, and you got to make sure and add it on both sides. Then you're going to factor this perfect square trinomial. So this was where we did a binomial squared. So that would be x plus 1 equals 3 plus 1, which would be 4. So now we got to factor the new perfect square trinomial. I'm sorry, that's what we just did. So now what we got to do is we got to solve using the square root property. So we're going to take the square root on both sides. So we got x plus 1 equals, we put the square root in, so plus or minus 2, because that's the square root of 4. I'm going to subtract 1 on both sides, so x equals 1, negative 1 plus or minus 2. Then I've got to break it up, so x equals negative 1 plus 2, x equals negative 1 minus 2, so x equals a positive 1, or x equals negative 3. Okay, and that's kind of just how to go through the process of how to complete the square. Alright, so let's do some real examples. So I got x squared plus 6x plus 7 equals 0. First thing I gotta do is I gotta decide if I can complete the square. So I have 1, 2, 3 terms, so it's 3 terms. My a equals 1, and my b is even. So that means I can complete the square. So my first step is to move the constant to the other side, so I'm going to subtract 7 on both sides. So I get x squared plus 6x plus blank, because that's my step 2, minus 7 plus blank. Then I got to figure out what goes into my blank, so I'm going to take my b divided by 2, and then I'm going to square that result. So my b is 6. 6 divided by 2, parentheses squared. 6 divided by 2 is 3, so 3 squared would give me a 9. So I'm going to go plus 9, and it's always plus. So now I've got to factor it, so I've got x plus 3, I pull it from right here, squared, and then negative 7 plus 9, it's going to be a positive 2. Next thing I do is got to apply that square root property. So I got x plus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 2. So I put the square root in there. Got to get x by itself, so I'm subtract 3 on both sides. So x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 2. And I can't combine them because I have a square root. So that's as far as I could take it. If you want to split it up, you can. You don't have to, though. Alright, next one. So we have x squared plus 4x minus 1. First thing I check for, I have 3 terms. My a equals 1, and my b is even. So I can complete the square. So first thing I do is I add the constant to both sides. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides. So I got x squared plus 4x plus blank equals 1 plus blank. Then I've got to figure out what goes in the blank, so I take my b divided by 2, parentheses squared, so 4 divided by 2 squared. 4 divided by 2 is 2, so 2 squared would leave me with 4, so that's what I put on the blank on both sides. Now I have to factor it, so I go my binomial squared and I plug in x plus 2, because that's what I got when I did b divided by 2, equals 1 plus 4 would be 5. Now to solve it from here, I've got to take my square root property. So I got x plus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 5. Don't have x by itself, so I subtract 2 on both sides, and I get x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 5. If you want to split them up, you can, but you don't have to. Hopefully the process is starting to make a little bit more sense. Okay? I want you to pause the video, and I want you to try to do this next one by yourself. Okay, so I have x squared plus 10x plus 8 equals 0. I have 3 terms. My a equals 1, and my b is even, so I can complete the square. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract my constant on both sides. So I got x squared plus 10x plus blank equals negative 8 plus blank. Next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out what goes in the blank. So I go b divided by 2 parentheses squared. So positive 10 divided by 2, which is 5 squared, which gives me 25. Okay. So when I clean this up, this would be x plus 5 squared equals negative 8 plus 25 is going to be a positive 17. Then I finish it out using my square root property. So I got x plus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of 17. Then I subtract 5 on both sides, and I'm left with x equals negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 17. And I can't combine them because they both don't have radicals. Hopefully you did okay on this one. Now what we're going to do is we're going to get into some trickier problems. So if I've got 4x squared plus 16x minus 9 equals 0. I see that I have 3 terms. I see that my b is even, but my a doesn't equal 1. So if your a does not equal 1, then divide everything by a. You can only do this when you're completing the square. You can't do this if it is 6.3 from beginning of the quarter. You only can do this when you're completing the square. So you have 3 terms and your middle term is even. Okay, and you're trying to complete the square. So if a doesn't equal 1, you divide everything by a. So we would divide everything by 4 as our first step. So we got x squared plus 4x minus 9 over 4 equals 0, because 0 divided by anything is 0. Okay, so now we can go through our steps. We're going to add 9/4 on both sides. So we get x squared plus 4x plus blank equals 9 over 4 plus blank. We got to figure out what completes the square. So we take 4 divided by 2 parentheses squared. So that would be 2 squared, which would equal 4. Okay, so when we factor this, this will be x plus 2 squared equals, and then, oh, here we go. You could plug this into your calculator or you could do it by hand. If I have 9 over 4 plus 4 over 1, remember you have to have the denominators be the same, so I could change this to 4 and 16, and 9 plus 16 is 25 over 4. Okay, now I can do my square root property, so I take the square root on both sides, so I'm left with x plus 2 equals plus or minus square root of 25 is 5, square root of 4 is 2. Okay, and then I've got to get the x by itself, so I'm subtract 2 from both sides. So I got x equals negative 2 plus or minus 5 over 2. And am I done with this equation? I still have to work with it. Okay, so the next thing that I need to do is I need to split this problem up. Okay, so I've got x equals negative 2 plus 5 over 2, and I got x equals negative 2 minus 5 over 2. Alright, I know fractions aren't the funnest, but you can plug it into your calculator to solve if you need to. That'd make it easier for you. Okay, I'm doing it by hand though, so have to have a common denominator. That would be 2, so it would be 4, so negative 4 plus 5 is going to be 1 over 2. Again, I have to change this to 2, 4, so x equals negative 9 over 2. Your calculator would have told you 0.5 and negative 4.5, which would totally work for me too. Okay, so let's try another one of those tricky problems. So we have 4x squared plus 4x minus 3 equals 0. So I'm trying to see if we can complete the square. We have to have 3 terms. We do. Our b has to be even, which it is, and our a has to equal 1. That's not the case, so the first thing we have to do if we're trying to complete the square is we've got to divide everything by our a, which is 4. So we'll have x squared plus x, because 4 divided by 4, if you want to put a 1 there you can, doesn't really matter, minus 3 over 4 equals 0. I move the constant, so I add 3 over 4 on both sides. So I got x squared plus 1x plus blank equals 3 over 4 plus blank. Alright, then I have to take my b and I have to divide it by 2 parentheses squared. So I take my 1 divided by 2 squared. So that would be 1 over 4. Which cleans up a little nice. So this has x plus 1/2 squared equals 1/4 plus 1/3 is going to be 4 over 4, which is 1. Then I take the square root on both sides. So I got x plus 1/2 equals plus or minus square root of 1 is 1. I subtract 1/2 on both sides. And I got x equals negative 1/2 plus or minus 1. I gotta split that up. So that'd be x equals negative 1/2 plus 1. X equals negative 1/2 minus 1. I'm going to put that over 1 so I can change it up. Alright, so in order to add or subtract fractions, we got to make sure and have a common denominator. So this would be 2, 2. So x equals negative 1 plus 2, so that would be 1/2. There's one of my answers. And then right here, 2, 2 again. So x equals negative 3 over 2. If you used your calculator, you would have had positive 0.5, and this one would have been negative 1.5. Either way completely works. Alright, so now I want you to try a tricky problem. I want you to try to see if you can do it yourself. So pause it and work this problem out for me. Okay, so I have 3x squared minus 12x plus 15 equals 0. First thing I see is I see 3 terms. My b is even, and my a does not equal 1. So because my a doesn't equal 1, I have to divide everything by 3 in order for me to complete the square. So I have x squared minus 4x plus 5 equals 0. Alright, next thing I want to do is I want to subtract the 5 on both sides. So I get x squared minus 4x plus blank equals negative 5 plus blank. Go negative 4 divided by 2, which is negative 2. I square that result and I get a positive 4. So when I factor this, I get x minus 2 squared equals negative 1. I take the square root on both sides, so I get x minus 2 equals plus or minus. Ooh, when I have a negative underneath the radical, remember that turns into I, so it's 1i. Or if you just put I, that works too. Then I'm going to add 2 on both sides. So x equals 2 plus or minus 1i. And that's as far as you can take it. Alright, so now what I need for you to do is I need you to do your 9.2 homework. But please, please, please make sure that you go through how you can complete the square. So make sure that you work hard on this, make sure you show all steps, and if you have any questions, make sure you bring them to class. Thank you.